We are continuing our journey through the cardiovascular system, starting with the heart. This recording is part 1 of 3. The heart functions as a pump, moving blood through the circulatory system to get oxygen and nutrients to cells in the body, and also to help transport carbon dioxide and waste products away from those cells in order that they may be excreted. There are 4 chambers to the heart, and each chamber ejects approximately 70 milliliters of blood every time the chamber contracts, and that's equal to approximately 1.4 gallons per minute. In order to understand how this works, we're going to take a closer look at the heart. The heart is located in the lungs in an area known as the mediastinum. The mediastinum, as you'll remember from A&P1, is not a cavity, it's simply an area between the 2 pleural cavities that contains 4 structures: the heart, the trachea, the thymus, and the esophagus. The heart resides in the pericardial cavity. The apex of the heart, which is that pointy end down to the right in this picture, in the bottom picture, is located slightly to the left in the human body, and it's accommodated by a small depression in the left lung that's called the cardiac notch. As you'll recall from A&P1, most of the organs in the ventral body cavity have serous membranes associated with them that produce serous fluid, which helps reduce friction when organs move. When you recall what you learned in A&P1, you'll remember that with the heart being in the pericardial cavity, the serous membrane that was closest to the heart itself was termed visceral pericardium. When we look at this picture and look closely at the term heart wall, which has other layers bracketed, you'll notice at the very top it says epicardium, which is the special term for the visceral layer of serous pericardium. You'll also notice that the epicardium folds back to form the parietal layer of serous pericardium, which we would call the parietal pericardium. However, the heart has a special outer layer that forms the pericardial or cardiac sac. This is the fibrous pericardium, which is a tough membrane made out of dense connective tissue. It helps protect the heart. It also helps to anchor the heart to surrounding structures, as well as preventing the heart from overfilling. The fibrous pericardium is external to both parietal and visceral layers of serous membranes. When we look at the layers a little bit more closely, starting with the bottom right, we see the epicardium, which is also called the visceral pericardium. And you can see there are 2 different layers of tissue. We have mesothelium and areolar connective tissue. The mesothelium is actually a type of epithelial tissue that is made up of simple squamous epithelium. If we look at the top right, we see that once that visceral pericardium folds back on itself, it forms the parietal pericardium, and the parietal pericardium also has a layer of simple squamous epithelium called the mesothelium, and then there's a layer of areolar connective tissue, and then finally we have a layer of dense fibrous connective tissue which forms that pericardial sac or cardiac sac, which surrounds the heart and gives it that 3rd layer of protection. If we look to the left, we see the muscular wall of the heart, known as the myocardium, that mostly is made up of cardiac muscle cells and some connective tissue. On the inside of that heart wall, we see at the bottom left the endocardium. Remember, the term endo means inside, and so the endocardium is that membrane that covers the inner portion of the heart chambers. The endocardium is made up of areolar connective tissue, which forms a base for the endothelium, which is made up of simple squamous epithelium. So again, the endocardium is made up of areolar connective tissue and endothelium. When we look at the application of where the heart is positioned within the thorax, before we go into the structures of the heart and how blood flows through the heart, I wanted to remind you of the fact that there are actually two different circuits or pathways for blood as it moves through our body. If we look at this picture and look at the top portion of this picture, you'll notice that there is a pulmonary circuit, and that portion of blood flow is going to receive oxygen poor blood that has already delivered oxygen to body tissues, and that blood is going to go towards the lungs. And it's in blue, even though those are pulmonary arteries, they're delivering oxygen poor blood to the lungs so that carbon dioxide can diffuse out of that blood, go into the air spaces of the lungs, and then oxygen can come back in through the lungs into the bloodstream. So we're getting rid of carbon dioxide and exchanging it for oxygen. So here's that oxygen poor blood that doesn't have very much oxygen going from the right side of the heart through pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and then as, again, carbon dioxide diffuses out, oxygen diffuses in, now we pick up oxygen-rich blood in the lungs, and that oxygen-rich blood is going to travel back to the heart so it can be transported throughout the body by way of the systemic circuit, which carries oxygen-rich blood throughout our body, including our heart, because the heart is a muscle and it needs oxygen and nutrients. So that oxygen-rich blood is going to flow back to the heart to the left side by way of pulmonary veins. And then from the pulmonary veins, we go into the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then that oxygenated blood is going to flow through the rest of the body. And then as it goes through, again, the body's going to use up that oxygen, and so we have oxygen poor blood that goes back to the heart. It's going to go through the superior and inferior vena cava, as well as through the coronary sinus into the right atrium, and then to the right ventricle, where it again will be sent next through the pulmonary circuit. So basically the pulmonary circuit is taking oxygen poor blood, exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen, making it oxygen rich, which then goes back to the heart, which is going to pump that oxygen rich blood back to the body so our cells can use the oxygen that we need to make adenosine triphosphate. And those are just the two different circuits through which our body is going to have blood be transported, so we make sure we get enough oxygen. Before we get into the chambers and circulation through the heart, I just wanted to remind you and point something out, that whenever we see blood vessels that are shown in red, that usually indicates that they are carrying fresh oxygenated blood, and blood vessels that are marked in blue are usually carrying oxygen poor blood. Now, in most of the body, blood vessels that carry fresh oxygenated blood are often associated in people's minds as arteries, and veins are the blood vessels that tend to carry oxygen poor blood. And this is true for the most part. However, the heart does have some exceptions, and we're going to talk about those when we talk about the flow of blood through the heart. And before we go through that, I wanted to point out the fact that there are 4 chambers in a normal heart. There are 2 upper chambers known as the atria, and we have a right atrium and a left atrium. And then the 2 lower chambers are the ventricles. We've got a right ventricle and a left ventricle. And normally when the heart beats, it beats like this. It goes atria, ventricles, pause, atria, ventricles, pause, atria, ventricles, pause. That means that the atria should contract at the same time and the ventricles should contract at the same time. Now, when blood is flowing through the body system, the systemic circuit, as oxygen and nutrients are delivered to the cells throughout the body, carbon dioxide and waste products are going to go back into that systemic circuit to come back to the heart. And so that oxygen-poor blood returns to the heart, and specifically to the right atrium, by way of the inferior vena cava. So it's coming from this direction, and then also in through the superior vena cava. That's collecting oxygen-poor blood that's already given up oxygen and nutrients to the body cells, and now there's not as much oxygen as there used to be. Also, our oxygen is never completely depleted. There's always a certain portion of oxygen that remains even in venous blood or oxygen-poor blood. Now there's another opening in the right atrium that's going to allow blood to come into this upper chamber. So we've got the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and there's a coronary sinus, and that is going to allow blood to enter into the right atrium after the oxygen has been given up to the muscle of the heart itself. The heart is the first organ to receive fresh oxygenated blood, and then the coronary sinus is going to deliver the oxygen-poor blood back to the right atrium. And they don't show it in this picture, but it exists. Now, as blood returns to the heart after it's been used up by the body system, all that oxygen has been used, well, not all of it, most of it, the pressure is going to build in that atrium, and it's not going to flow into the right ventricle just yet, because there is a valve that closes off the right atrium, and only when enough pressure builds up in the right atrium will it force this valve, called the tricuspid valve, to open up, allowing 70% of the blood in the right atrium to flow into the right ventricle. The remaining 30% is ejected from the right atrium into the right ventricle when the atria contract. That's going to squeeze the remainder of the blood into the right ventricle. So again, pressure forces the tricuspid valve open. Now, after the atria contract, the ventricles are going to start contracting, and the back force of pressure on the tricuspid valve that occurs when the ventricles start contracting and building up pressure, that actually closes off that tricuspid valve so blood can't flow the wrong way. And the pressure building up is going to open up this valve right here, the pulmonary valve. Some books call it the pulmonic valve. So here's the term pulmonary valve. As pressure builds up in the right ventricle, it's going to force the pulmonary valve to open, allowing blood to flow into what's often called the pulmonary trunk. Okay, the pulmonary trunk branches into a right and left pulmonary artery, but this whole big vessel here, even though it says PA and it stands for pulmonary artery, technically it's the pulmonary trunk. And once that valve is open and that blood gets forced into the pulmonary trunk, the pressure of the blood in the pulmonary trunk helps to close this pulmonary valve, which is also called a semilunar valve because they look like little moons. So blood is now on its way through the right and left pulmonary arteries. It's going to go to the lungs. Now notice it's in pulmonary arteries, but it's oxygen poor. So arteries are technically blood vessels that carry blood, whether it's oxygenated or not. They carry blood to another organ. And in this case, the pulmonary arteries are going to the lungs, and they're blue because they're carrying oxygen poor blood. Now, blood is not blue, even venous blood or oxygen poor blood. It's that it has a darker appearance normally because arterial blood or oxygen-rich blood has more oxygen bound to hemoglobin, and that actually gives it a bright red color. So now we've got oxygen poor blood going through arteries, which is why they're blue, to the lungs, and oxygen poor blood has a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. So as that blood goes to the lungs, the carbon dioxide diffuses from an area of high concentration to low concentration into the airways where it can be exhaled, and then oxygen as it's inhaled will diffuse into the bloodstream to be carried back to the heart by way of pulmonary veins. And there are two pulmonary veins on either side coming back to the left atrium. And the same thing holds true with pressure building up in the left atrium. As blood flows into the left atrium is separated from the left ventricle by the mitral valve. And then once enough pressure builds up in the left atrium from blood returning to it, the pressure is going to open up the mitral valve, allowing 70% of the blood to flow passively from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And then after that contraction, ejecting the remaining 30%, the left ventricle will begin to contract, forcing the mitral valve to close. And as pressure builds, it will open up this other semilunar valve known as the aortic valve. The aortic valve is another semilunar valve. So the pulmonary valve and aortic valves are semilunar, and then we've got the tricuspid valve on the right and the bicuspid or mitral valve on the left. Then as pressure builds in the left ventricle, forcing the aortic valve to open up, blood is going to flow into the aorta, where it will then go to the rest of the body. And there are right and left coronary arteries that are the first branches off of the aorta that will deliver fresh oxygenated blood to the heart. The heart actually gets fresh oxygenated blood first. And if you think about it, it's important because the heart has to beat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the heart gets it first, and then it continues throughout the rest of the body, which is the systemic circuit. And once blood flows into the aorta, the pressure of that blood in that blood vessel is what closes the aortic valve behind it so it can't wash backwards. The valves are really important in allowing blood to flow unidirectionally in one direction, and they also help prevent the backwash of blood so that blood can go in that one direction. If there's a problem with the valves, then that can cause problems depending on how bad the valve is. And if you've ever heard of regurgitation or mitral valve regurgitation, that's usually a problem with the mitral valve where it's not operating the way it's supposed to, and a little blood might flow backwards from the left ventricle into the left atrium. On this slide, we get to see the anterior external anatomy of the heart. And if you look on the left side of the picture, you can see the right atrium, and below it, the right ventricle. Moving around, we see the apex of the heart, as well as the left ventricle, and the left atrium, and more specifically, it's pointing to the auricle of the left atrium. Both of the atria have ear-like flaps known as auricles to help give a little more volume to the atria themselves. We don't see the auricle of the right atrium in this particular picture. And I also wanted to point out the ligamentum arteriosum, which is this ligament right here. The ligamentum arteriosum is a fibrous connective tissue remnant of what used to be the ductus arteriosus. And the ductus arteriosus was a way for the baby's body, when the baby was in the mother's womb, to have blood go from the right ventricle directly into the aorta to circulate blood and bypass the lungs. Because remember, babies aren't breathing when they're inside the womb because they're in amniotic fluid. So the baby would receive oxygen and nutrients through the umbilicus, and to bypass the lungs, there used to be this little passageway or duct, the ductus arteriosus. We'll see this again. Here are the external structures when we look at the posterior surface of the heart. And again, we can see this time, since we flipped it around, here's the left atrium, and they're also pointing out the auricle of the left atrium. And here we can see the right atrium. Now, they don't point out the right auricle, but there is an auricle for the right atrium as well. Here's the right ventricle. You can see the blood vessels associated with the heart that are external to it. We're going to go over those in another PowerPoint slide. And I just wanted to point out to you how we see the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava. You can see where the coronary sinus would return blood from the heart back to that right atrium, even though we're not looking inside the atrium. And we have our pulmonary arteries. So we've got a right pulmonary artery and a left pulmonary artery. Remember, they're carrying oxygen poor blood, and they're going to the lungs. But then we have our left and right pulmonary veins, which are bringing fresh oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium. And you'll notice there's two of those on each side. When we look at the orientation of cardiac muscle fibers, there is a swirling pattern within the heart that allows the heart to function as a syncytium or single unit when those atria and the ventricles contract. So it's much more efficient than if these were arranged in a linear fashion. Now, even though both sides of the heart are going to pump the same volume of blood, the distance that has to be traveled systemically is much farther. So the left side of the heart, which is where the left ventricle is located and has to pump fresh oxygenated blood throughout the body, is going to be thicker than the right ventricle simply because the left ventricle has to generate more pressure in order to get the blood to travel farther. Now we're looking at the internal structure of the heart again, and these structures should be somewhat more familiar for you. Here again, we see the superior vena cava, the right pulmonary artery. Remember, it's going to the lungs, so it's oxygen poor. We see the pulmonary trunk. We see the right atrium. We see the right pulmonary veins. And then there's a structure within, actually it's between the right atrium and the left atrium. In the adult heart, it's called the fossa ovalis. In the fetal heart, it's an open area. This is a closed depression. The fossa ovalis is a closed depression. But in a baby that's developing in its mother's womb, that's actually an opening with little flaps between the right atrium and the left atrium called the foramen ovale. And the foramen ovale again allows blood to bypass the lungs by going directly from the right atrium to the left atrium, because remember, babies are not breathing inside the womb, they're in amniotic fluid. And we know that we have between the right atrium and the right ventricle the tricuspid valve. We also have the right ventricle. And holding the valve, that tricuspid valve, to the actual wall of the heart, we have special little string-like tendons or cords called chordae tendineae. So they anchor that valve to the muscle of the internal heart wall. And then there's a trabecular pattern or a lace-like pattern inside the wall of the ventricles called the trabeculae carni. And then finally we have the inferior vena cava down below at the bottom. I didn't go over the pectinate muscles because you can't see them very well here on the right atrium, but they are comb-like in appearance, and they're towards the anterior wall of the right atrium. When we go to the left side, we see the aorta. Remember, there's an ascending area, an arch, and a descending area. We have our left pulmonary artery taking oxygen poor blood to the lungs. We have the left atrium. We have the left pulmonary veins, the mitral or bicuspid valve, and then going to the systemic circulation, we have from the left ventricle through the aortic valve to the aorta, and we also see our pulmonary valve going towards the pulmonary trunk. We've got the left ventricle. Again, we've got little papillary muscles. Remember, a papilla is a nipple-like projection, and the papillary muscles are the muscles to which the chordae tendineae of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are going to attach. There is a wall between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. That's the interventricular, between the ventricles. Septum, the word septum means wall. And then on the outside of the heart, we have the epicardium, which is the same thing as the visceral pericardium. Then we have the muscular portion, which is the myocardium. And then we have on the inside of the wall of the heart, endocardium. Endo means inside. Next, we're going to take a look at the structure of the atrioventricular valves. So these are the tricuspid and bicuspid or mitral valves, and they are made up of cusp-like structures. They have chordae tendineae that will attach them to the papillary muscles. So again, if we look at blood returning to the heart on both sides, right and left, it fills the atria on both sides. As pressure builds up, that forces the atrioventricular valves. And if you think of the term atrioventricular, well, it's between the atria and the ventricles. So the pressure will force those valves to open up, and then when the atria contract, they'll eject that remaining 30% of blood that they contain into the ventricles. And then when the ventricles begin to contract, they are going to close off the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, and as they build pressure, blood will be forced through these semilunar valves in between the ventricle, the right ventricle and pulmonary trunk. So we're going to send our poorly oxygenated blood through the pulmonary trunk to go to the lungs, and then as pressure builds in the left ventricle, that will open up the aortic valves that you can't see really well in this picture, and it forces blood that is oxygen rich into the aorta. So here we see a picture of the atrioventricular valve open, and here we see what it looks like when they are closed. So when that first heart sound occurs, when a person is listening with a stethoscope, the first heart sound is the lub of the lub-dub, and the lub is the closing of the atrioventricular valves as the ventricles start contracting to build up pressure. So it's actually the closing of the valves that you hear when you hear those heart sounds. This takes us to the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are located between the right ventricle and pulmonary trunk, as well as the left ventricle and the aorta. And somebody decided that they look like little moons, and that's how they got their name. So after blood goes from the atria to the ventricles begin to contract, shutting off the atrioventricular valves, building up pressure, and keeping blood from flowing back into the atria. And when enough pressure builds up, the semilunar valves to the pulmonary trunk and the aorta will open up. And here we can see those valves opening, and then once pressure from the blood that's been ejected into the pulmonary trunk as well as into the aorta, once that pressure builds up, that pressure is going to cause the semilunar valves to close, preventing that backwash of blood from those large vessels into the ventricles from which they came. And it's the closing of those valves that produces the second heart sound, or the dub, that occurs at the beginning of ventricular diastole. Now, diastole is relaxation, systole is contraction. Okay, so systole occurs with ventricular contraction, and then diastole occurs when the ventricles, after the ventricles have contracted completely, then they relax, and that's ventricular diastole. So there's a few things that can occur with the heart valves. It's really important for them to be functioning correctly because they help keep blood moving in one direction. The right side of the heart moves blood towards the lungs, and then the left side of the heart has to move blood to the rest of the body. And because the left side has to have a stronger force of contraction to build up enough pressure to send blood throughout the body, it's not uncommon, especially with older people, for the mitral valve to start to become a little bit more rigid or inflexible, and the mitral valve is actually the most common valve that is affected, and sometimes the whole valve can prolapse where it just goes backwards into the atrium, and sometimes it just allows a little bit of blood to regurgitate back into the left atrium. Depending on the severity of the damage to the valve may need to be or not need to be replaced. And it's not uncommon for elderly people to have murmurs, which are that whooshing sound that occurs when the valve is not closing properly. And sometimes, again, as valves become rigid or even calcified, they're less flexible. Even the chordae tendineae can weaken and become either thick or short, or papillary muscles can die. So there are a lot of things associated with the valves. And again, depending on the amount of blood that's washing back the wrong way and the extent of damage to a valve would determine whether or not an individual needed to have a valve replacement. Remember, we said the heart is the first organ in the body to get fresh oxygenated blood. And coming off of the aorta, directly off the aorta, they kind of made it a little bit transparent, if you can see that in here. Coming right off of the aorta, we have a left and right coronary artery. Okay, so those guys are coming right off of the aorta. And the left coronary artery is going to break into two major branches, and one of those branches is the anterior interventricular artery, which is this artery here. Anterior, so it's on the anterior surface, interventricular, between the ventricles. So the anterior interventricular artery comes off the left coronary artery, and sometimes it's also called the left anterior descending artery. This is going to be found in a groove on the anterior surface of the heart that's known as the interventricular sulcus, and it's responsible for supplying fresh blood to the anterior walls of both ventricles, as well as the interventricular septum. And the other branch from the left coronary artery is a branch called the circumflex artery. And the circumflex artery supplies the left atrium as well as the posterior walls of the left ventricle. Next, we're going to look at the right coronary artery. Here we have the right coronary artery, and here you can see it over here. The right coronary artery is going to split into a right marginal artery, which supplies the myocardium on the lateral side of the heart, as well as the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, so here's the posterior interventricular artery. And the posterior interventricular artery is going to supply fresh oxygenated blood to the posterior walls of both ventricles, and it's also found near the apex of the heart where it anastomoses or merges with the anterior interventricular artery. So the posterior interventricular and the anterior interventricular arteries actually form a merger or an anastomosis with one another. And you can see that strange little area where they branch out and kind of have little pathways. Those are the anastomoses of the right and left interventricular arteries. Next, we're going to take a look at the anterior surface of the heart to see the cardiac veins. And venous blood is going to be collected by those cardiac veins that have pathways that tend to follow those of the arteries. And these veins will also merge together or anastomose to form a special structure called the coronary sinus. And you can see the coronary sinus here. And the coronary sinus is going to empty directly into the right atrium. Now, we also have the great cardiac vein, which is going to be in the interventricular sulcus with the anterior interventricular artery. And the great cardiac vein will anastomose or merge with the middle cardiac vein, which is right here. So that's where this one will actually come around and merge with that. This is where the anastomosis is. So here's the middle cardiac vein. And then we also have the small cardiac vein, which is right here. And that will go along with the right inferior margin of the heart. And then we have some anterior cardiac veins on the anterior surface as well. And the anterior cardiac veins are basically going to empty into the anterior area of the right atrium. So not only do we have the coronary sinus, but we actually have little veins that are going to empty into the right atrium. For me, if I ask you what empties into the right atrium, I'd basically expect you to know the inferior and superior vena cava and the coronary sinus. When coronary arteries become blocked due to an accumulation of plaque or vasospasm, then that can lead to what's known as a myocardial infarction. The term infarction simply refers to tissue death. Bone can have infarction. There's bone infarcts. But for myocardial infarction, usually those are diagnosed either with an MRI or EKG or echocardiograph, sometimes with MRI. They can also do blood tests like creatine kinase, cardiac troponin, or atrial natriuretic peptide. Understand that myocardial infarction is not the same thing as a cardiac arrest. In a cardiac arrest, the heart actually stops because of abnormal electrical activity, and both these conditions, myocardial infarctions and cardiac arrest, are considered medical emergencies. When we look at coronary artery disease, it usually is a result of a buildup of plaque in the arterial walls that are found within the heart, and that impedes the flow of blood and also decreases the flexibility of blood vessels. It's also sometimes referred to as atherosclerosis. And as muscle cells become hypoxic, which means they don't have enough oxygen, an individual may experience chest pain known as angina pectoris. And usually coronary artery disease is something that begins in childhood with fatty streaks of plaque in vessels, in blood vessels. However, other factors can contribute to coronary artery disease, including things like genetics, too much alcohol, smoking, stress, diabetes, or even being too sedentary. Those can all contribute to the problem, and treatment's going to vary depending on the cause of the problem.